All right, how's it going, everyone? This is Brian, and welcome back to the Tech Stack Playbook, your guide to apps, software, and tech, but in a fun way, I promise. So I've been diving into quite a bit of AI, mainly on the machine learning side and the data pipeline side. And between the MLOps pipeline side of things, and then from actually an app configuration standpoint, it really just stems down to a few core areas. And ML pipelines become very complicated the more that you need them to do. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about AI and machine learning. And I gave a talk this past week to one of the AWS user groups in Boston. And what I was able to talk about was my journey through building AI and MLOps pipelines with Amazon SageMaker. And I, of course, as I'm sure you have been following AI in the news, and my journey in AI actually started last year, kind of a little bit before the ChatGPT kind of hype, OpenAI and everything like that with large language models. So I had been really looking at AI from a data perspective of basically, I have this goal. I'm going to be taking in data. What can this data tell me about something? And then how can I get an output? So that process of business use case to take in data and process it and then deliver an output. That's been something that I've been actually looking at quite a bit because, you see apps like ChatGPT, you might see apps like Hugging Face Chat, you might see Google Bard, and you see these chat interfaces, and you're able to communicate with a machine learning model or a large language model or an LLM, and then you wonder, well, what does that mean? I mean, I get that I'm typing in something and then I guess hitting an endpoint, and then the model is doing something, interpreting what I said and then getting it back, and it becomes very confusing because there's quite a lot of steps that apps like ChatGPT, Bard, or Hugging Face Chat abstract away because they make it really easy for users to interact with AI, machine learning. So it's all happening behind the scenes, and then you're not really even thinking about it. It's just literally working for you, but you don't know that it's an AI necessarily. It's just, hey, it's a chat. It's a chatbot, and it's interacting with me, and I'm interacting with it. And then, I'm answering a question or giving it a question, then it's answering it and maybe posing a question. So this exchange between question and answer with a large language model has never really been achieved on a scale as big as it is right now. And I was actually looking at a lot of these types of things last year going into this year. So it's been really exciting to see the evolution of this space and seeing how far large language models and just MLOps in general and those pipelines are becoming. Because now the ability to just talk to the internet, I mean, that's unprecedented. That's never happened before. So I'm really excited about this space because I can see how when you take data and then now you can train a model around a specific custom data set. And then now you can have like specific outputs about, I have questions about what's the best type of clothing to wear at this event. I am trying to build an application, but I want to know what the right framework is for mobile development. I want to know how to raise a child when they're 5 years old. Like, you could have parents asking that question. You could have developers asking the other question. You could just have general conversations with the smartest models on the planet, which is really cool. So in my talk to the Boston AWS user group, I dive into my 3 core steps or phases that I've gone down into the AI rabbit hole. And just to kind of give a little bit of a heads up on what I was specifically talking about, to give you a little bit of a preview, I introduced sort of 3 core areas that you can get started with AI. The first, which is probably the least barrier of resistance, is with a large language model. So what you could do is that you could, load up OpenAI's ChatGPT, Google Bard, Hugging Face's Hugging Chat, and you could just start talking to it. And you'll actually learn quite a lot about how large language models are structured based upon different answers that you ask it. Another thing to also note, though, is that if you ask the same question to a large language model, you will probably get different responses. So that's where you need to be a little bit careful about not using large language models for quantitative data back, that means, you need a standardized number back. So let's say that you are scoring something, like you're scoring essays or text, and it needs to have a certain sentiment score. So let's say like text messages or posts in a social media application. You want to know the sentiment of that. If it's a happy post, if it's an angry post, if it's a confused post, if it's an anxious post, something like that. So you wouldn't necessarily want to use a large language model for that, because you could probably give a response or an input and then get a different response back each time. You would want a more standardized way where if given something, get an output, kind of like a function. So that's where large language models are interesting, because they become very creative about how they give data back to users, but you don't want to necessarily use that for numeric responses if that's a requirement. So there's a lot of cool ways where you can start asking large language models questions and then getting pretty interesting answers back. You can also ask large language models how they're built, and they'll be able to walk you through a lot of those core components in case you want to learn how to build it yourself or at least understand it. So the second area that I went down on the AI rabbit hole was looking at Amazon CodeWhisperer, and that's been an amazing code interpreter and basically an AI pair programming buddy. So what's really interesting about these types of tools, and just another example that would be like GitHub Copilot, there's tons of these different types of coding tools, but what's really interesting is that when you are using your code interpreter or your code pair programming buddy in VS Code, for example, or IntelliJ or IDE that you're using. I like VS Code, but you could be coding in anything else that you like. By having that a part of your code base, now you're powered by AI. So as you type in your code, as it's analyzing your code base, it'll actually start giving back responses that are commensurate to how you actually code. And I think that's really interesting because just a really specific example. So there's a way that I do comments in my code usually, and I'll usually do like a line that'll be like a bunch of enters, and then a title, and then another line with enters. And then I sort of like break up my code so that I can see when I'm scrolling, this is related to, this subset of code, this is related to this subset of code. And Amazon CodeWhisperer actually started picking up on the fact that I do that. And then when I started to look like I was writing a comment, it would actually model my own syntax. And I thought that was crazy cool, because now I'm able to be more efficient with my coding, because now I have a standardized way to check that. And there's there's different types of these integrations for making your code syntax aligned with design requirements. But then to have AI suggesting recommendations for your code based upon how you actually code, I mean, that's just next level. So I've had a huge amount of fun using that with my code. And then I also show some examples of how Amazon CodeWhisperer has actually helped me coding, even in languages that it doesn't actually support, like GraphQL, for example. So you'll see that in my talk. The third area that I dive into are 2 technical workshops that I did over the past year. And it was really interesting because they have a lot of really helpful feedback about how to use Amazon SageMaker, and even different types of tools within SageMaker. And I've really enjoyed learning the actual nuts and bolts of getting data sets, doing some sort of hyperparameter tuning if possible, and learning about that. Even in Amazon SageMaker Canvas, they have a sort of a quick build train method that you can use to then actually train your model that you use. Like we use time series in this in the workshop that I showed. So we use time series, but then you're able to do this quick 10 to 15 minute build process, and then you're able to then have a model that interpreted your data and then forecasted something. So I thought that was really exciting, and those 2 workshops, which I'll show in the slides in a second, but those 2 workshops have been hands down really helpful for me to understand how to build with these tools. So to sum up, what we were able to do in my talk was start at a baseline layer. We're going to start with interpreting and using large language models. Then we're going to start using a code interpreter or an AI pair programming buddy with Amazon CodeWhisperer. And then in the third step, we're actually going to go into Amazon SageMaker and learn how that works and why that's really effective. So I hope you're excited to listen to this talk that I gave, and I hope that it provides a lot of value for you on your AI journey. So with that, I will roll the video next, and let's get started and dive into AI. Yeah, so hey everyone, my name is Ryan Huff, and this is going to be a presentation on a number of different things, but mainly talking about just the do's, don'ts, and gotchas from my first explorations into AI. So I come at this as a software engineer, mainly doing full stack stuff. So it's you building front ends, building APIs, building data models, a lot of cloud building on AWS, obviously, which makes sense because that's why we're here. So of course, I was a little bit skeptical at the beginning of this year to go into AI, and I didn't just want to start building AI just because everyone's doing it. I needed like a real reason. And just as an AWS community builder, I kind of came at this from okay, let's understand the data pipeline of this. Let's understand the endpoint, the API endpoint. How are we actually configuring this in a backend to go and do something? Because I try not to FOMO out of certain things and just try to really understand why would someone use SageMaker or not. And that's a lot of where I got that perspective was from building. So first of all, just in the chat, I would just love to know if people have thoughts on what is AI, because it's such a nebulous topic, I think, and it means a lot of different things to different types of people. I feel like AI could just be a model, AI could be a pipeline, AI could be using ChatGPT or Hugging Face Chat or Bard to answer questions. AI could be, GitHub Copilot or Amazon CodeWhisperer. I'm just kind of curious if folks want to share kind of what they think about AI. And while they do that, I pulled this from Google, and I literally just searched for AI, try to find news. And I feel like it's either hit or miss, where will AI save the world? So that was blog from Andreessen Horowitz, and then CNBC talking about AI doomers, and sort of there's like good and then there's bad, and it really just depends on the day and what you search. And the either news, I feel like it's about a stronger, healthier, happier, more fortified human existence, or it's about the extinction of the human race, and that is very soon to now. And I have been really trying to grapple with this over the past year, because then I'm thinking, okay, like, am I supposed to just know AI? Should I have already known AI? Am I too late? And that's when I was like, okay, like, if the AI overlords are going to like overtake us, I probably need to learn at least something about this. So then that brought me into the next problem, which was, do I understand what machine learning is? And before we get even into that, I just saw someone in the chat. AI equals code that helps recognize patterns, make decisions, or generate content in a way that seems intelligent. Eric, I really like that answer. That's a really, really robust answer. Brian, AI lets me avoid certain some things in my short-term memory. Yep, that's totally true. So kind of expanding what you could normally do in your day-to-day. This is now an extension of your senses, of your thinkings. And then obvious, I tend to think of AI as a big pile of linear algebra and statistics. And if you don't like what you get, you stir the pile and try again. Yes, yeah, that is so true. I'm just reacting to that in the chat, because yeah, it's kind of what you get is potentially what you get, but then you can change the prompt, you can change how you reorder the data or train it on new data, and then now you can bring in new experiences. We kind of saw that publicly with going from ChatGPT 3.5 to 4. We were talking about that earlier before the talk. So it's just really interesting, because a lot of these topics that have kind of become very closed door, not a lot of people care about it unless you're a data engineer or you do data science or you're a Python person or you're an AI engineer. A lot of this stuff wasn't in the news. It was just sort of people just did that. Companies had AI, or you didn't. But no, it was never really making news. But just kind of going back from this, when I was trying to figure out, kind of the news scene, I was like, okay, AI seems scary, but I'm reading about ML. So I knew about machine learning, but I actually was like, what is ML? So kind of in the chat, just because you all are answering great stuff. So I'm really curious as I go into this next part of, what do you think about machine learning? What do you think about ML just generally? Is it the application of an AI thesis. Is machine learning a pipeline it does, with predefined steps? Is it fixed? Can it be dynamic? Can it change? Um, when I first came across machine learning, I it basically came out to be something like this. And there were like all of these steps, and then I was thinking like, wait. I thought AI was just a model, and now there's these like 15 other things that I have to do with the model. So now I'm thinking, okay, so is the model less important? Is the pipeline more important? Um, and I see in the chat, Brian, you just posted an intelligent helper, like a fighter pilot's assistant that helped offload the workload. Yep. So yeah, it's that understanding of like where does AI end and machine learning begin? And I was really trying to understand all the pieces together because for me, I'm a very visual learner. I'm a very visual builder. If I can mock something up in Figma, if I can put something together in Lucidchart, that personally helps me understand what I'm doing and not get lost in the sauce of all these different pieces together and they're kind of there, but how are they linked? So just to kind of walk through this. So, you have the data collection, data cleaning. This is, ingesting some sort of data set and then basically getting it to a part where the model could understand what you want, or maybe just removing data that's not necessary or needed in your pipeline. Then there's a feature extraction and a selection stage, and then a model selection stage. So this is where we're trying to understand exactly what we want to learn or what we want to export out of our pipeline. And then we'll choose a model. I heard you all talking about model selection earlier before this talk. So it was just interesting hearing that part of it, but that's where that goes. Then we're going to train that model. And then you could do something with hyperparameter tuning. That can get expensive, but if you want to do that, definitely is important for getting a model that can be really optimally trained on what you want. Then you'll do validation testing. There'll be some sort of evaluation step. And then once you get it to a part where you like it and it's getting a response, you'll do a deployment. You might want to set up API gateway and be able to integrate through Lambda. Your app hits a Lambda function that's hitting API gateway to invoke your model. Responses come back. I'm also looking at AppSync. I've been building a lot with AppSync recently, so I am looking at how AppSync could work liaising between SageMaker and Lambdas, just so that your users aren't directly hitting your model. It's kind of hitting something that hits it, just so that there isn't that direct connection that's open. And then, of course, these are some of the really important steps that you hear in the news if something goes wrong. But monitoring and maintenance, ethics and morality becomes really important in terms of, is your data representative? Are the outputs that you're getting representative of what you want? Are you getting bad data that's not reflective of certain use cases or certain questions or certain audiences? And then security as well, super important. And then making sure that also documentation and accessibility are top of mind. How accessible is this to be used? Are people being brought to the table that can be included? Are people being left out of the conversation of people that could have inputs to make this model, this pipeline better? And then, of course, this is the consultants. I always, whenever I say like a real world use case, I always have put on my like consultant or business consultant hat, because I always hear it in a business consultant voice where it's like, are we actually solving a real problem? So that's the other thing too, though, right? You can build this whole pipeline, but then maybe it actually doesn't solve a real problem at the end of the day. So that's kind of where you want to, hedge a lot of bets in the beginning and then try to understand exactly what you're building. Are we actually building something that's validatable? But the other way to look at this is just one big yikes. There's a lot of steps here. There is a lot going on, and we have to build all of this, right? Because we've been tasked by our company or our team to build an AI pipeline, and we have to go through all of these steps. So you're thinking, yikes, is there an easier way? And there might not be an easier way, but we can use tools and abstractions to help curb that big yikes to be more digestible. So when I was going through this, I was left with a feeling of, let's try to figure this technology out fast, but where do we even start, right? There are so many things going on. There's all these models being released. Do we feel like we're ahead, like behind the curve? How do we actually navigate this? So that's what I'm going to be talking about in my talk. And just to give a little bit of a context to who I am. So my name is Brian Huff. I'm a software engineer and a content creator. I'm also an AWS community builder, along with Brian Tarbox. So that it's been a really great community. If you've been a part of AWS Community Builders, The application actually ends tonight. So if you actually are interested in being a community builder, definitely apply. I made a LinkedIn post with the link to apply. So if you check out my LinkedIn, be sure to apply. And I'm also the creator of the Tech Stack Playbook. So that has been my journey over the last few years, really diving into cloud. I've been building blockchain. I've been building a lot of different types of cutting edge systems. It's been really exciting. And I'm also a co-founder of a platform called the Capital Platform. If you are going to be in New York at the New York Summit, I'm actually giving a talk on the serverless micropayments system and architecture that I built for our platform. It's pretty cool, I think. So if you want to learn more about how I built that and how we're scaling that, definitely be sure to check out my dev chat at the New York Summit at the end of this month. I'm also a 5-time global hackathon winner. I got really into tech through learning in public and building open source stuff at hackathons. So I'm a big fan of the hackathon, rapid build in a weekend type mentality. And I've really just been building and learning and exploring. And it's been really exciting, especially to build on AWS, where I've been building some enterprise systems and building apps and architectures, microservices, kind of you name it. I've been learning about it, been doing some CloudFormation stuff, some web application firewall stuff this week, and just some AI things as well, and a lot of API stuff and data modeling. So yeah, a lot of good cloud building opportunities. So what are we going to do today? So we're going to go through about 5 things. We're going to go through just an intro to AI and ML. We're going to go through an intro to large language models. We're going to go into Amazon CodeWhisperer. We're going to go to Amazon SageMaker. And then I'm going to give you guys some resources to build upon so that by the end of this talk, we're going to be able to illuminate, hopefully, a path into the AI space for you so that you can kind of hit AI wherever you're interested in. And you can dive as much or as little as you want. But this is sort of to help give you different touch points so that you can dive into the rabbit hole as much or as little as you'd like. So let's just kind of quickly dive into AI and ML really quickly. So the 3 pathways that I think people could get into AI and ML, large language models, especially the ChatGPTs, the Google Bards, the Hugging Face, Hugging Chats, those are free, but you could pay for ChatGPT if you want the GPT-4 model. But these are free tools to use, and they're really interesting because if you deconstruct how these large language models work, when you just enter in a chat, yeah, sure, like you're kind of typing something and then it gives you back an answer. But if you actually ask it the same question, but in different streams, so if you create like a new conversation and you ask it the same prompt, it will give you different answers usually. And it's really interesting because that's the generative AI element of that. And that was really interesting because Chip Huen, she wrote a book on data pipelines on O'Reilly, and it's a really great AI expert. And she published a blog recently, and she was talking about how if you were to make the AI be like a teacher and they're grading papers, it's really interesting because it'll give different answers. And if you wanted to use an AI for standardization quantitatively, that's not really the best use case. You would want more of an algorithm that can, like a sentiment analysis score. If you sort of have these variable creative outputs, that's where large language models can kind of fall a little bit apart. So it's really interesting when you learn what can a large language model do, what can it not. And if you're looking for a large language model to give you back a number, it could give you back a score that's very different each time, even if it's the same input. So just something to think about of how large language models work. Amazon CodeWhisperer, very, very, very great use case. If you've also used GitHub Copilot, similar-ish thing. It's giving you AI pair programming predictions and then answers for code that you want to write. I've been using Amazon CodeWhisperer. It's been awesome, and it's a free tool, really great to just get started using AI. And I think that's kind of where we go from 1 to 2. We kind of use a large language model, we talk to one. Now we're going to be actually a practitioner of a large language model, and that's where we're actually start using it in our work. And then Amazon SageMaker is when we make our work for us. And that's kind of this third iterative where now we're building something with a model, we're training it with some data, and then we're getting some output. So those are the 3 touch points that I like to recommend to other people based upon how I've been exposed to AI. You don't have to just start on SageMaker. I think it's often better if you use these other examples and then kind of ease your way into SageMaker, because SageMaker is a lot. They have a lot of tools. We'll get into that, but you just don't feel like you have to just like automatically be in SageMaker, or like if you're not that's not AI, because there's so many different ways to use AI.
And
So
Brian, if I could, if you just go back just for 1 second.
sure, yeah.
One of the things that I've noticed is, because I also use CodeWhisperer a lot, and also ChatGPT 4, a lot of people are saying, hey, ChatGPT, write me the Terraform to write my whole, application. And the what I've noticed is ChatGPT always gives you an answer that seems reasonable. It may be completely wrong. It may be a complete hallucination, which is the clever term for, false. Um, but it will invoke APIs that ought to exist. But if the API that you're actually trying to call isn't completely orthogonal, it'll make stuff up. Whereas I found that CodeWhisperer gives me code that actually works, that compiles. So it's just interesting in that, CodeWhisperer is a much more constrained system. Generate code that actually is, whereas an LLM is just like, under the covers, it's just finding what the percentage is of the next word in the answer. So anyway, so I think actually going through those steps before you get to SageMaker is interesting, and trying to get a chat or a Hugging Face to give you an answer that's completely nonsense is very instructive.
Yeah, and I want to build off of what you just said, Brian, because it's really interesting with the CodeWhisperer part, because I've spoken to other software engineers that have used GitHub Copilot, and I talked about like, oh, like would you use CodeWhisperer versus GitHub Copilot? And I said, oh well, I mainly build on AWS, so I probably want CodeWhisperer. And they were like, why? Like, isn't GitHub Copilot like the best? And I was like, well, maybe it is. Like, it kind of depends. Because if you think about the model that's training, or the data set that's training the model and giving in new data, the chances of Amazon AWS building tooling that could help you build on AWS is probably higher than what GitHub Copilot might have. I also don't want to like make allegations of other people's technology that I don't know and I can't validate, but at least from my assumption, the thinking of that is important, because when we think about SageMaker, right, and I'll show you guys some examples of some projects that I've built, and the resources of how to build them yourself as well, and you could take it for a spin too. But I was just thinking about that, where it's like, okay, the data is really important going in, because data in, data out. So for Amazon CodeWhisperer, like if I'm building on AWS, I'm not trying to shill CodeWhisperer, but that's kind of my approach of why I wanted to use CodeWhisperer. I mean, it's also free, which is like a great plug, for at least from the Amazon side. But I figured for helping me build better client-side AWS code, CodeWhisperer would be helpful for me. So, and that's proven to be really true. And you'll see that actually in the later slides. So just an introduction to large language models and what I've been experiencing with prompt engineering. So I thought that, oh yeah, okay, go inside. So I thought that this conversation was really interesting. This is actually a slide from a presentation I'm giving in New York next, in a week, or actually in 2 weeks now. But if any of you know about the Prime Video kind of controversy, where like they were using step functions and lambdas, and then they moved to a server, a designated server to be running certain systems. This sparked so much debate in the serverless community, because then they were like, oh my goodness, not using serverless. I thought serverless was so scalable. What? And it was just really fascinating, because it was also like the most spicy hot take I've ever seen, like ever. And I was like, oh my goodness, like who penned this? So it was just interesting, because it was just a very, very big kind of eruption of conversation of like, when would you use Lambda? When would you use serverless? When would you use a server? When would you use containers? And I think there's a valid debate for both in certain use cases. But I thought it would be really interesting, because I built the Capital platform with a serverless mindset, because we're a startup. We don't necessarily know what we need, and we need to figure this out. So for my talk, which you'll see if you go to New York, but the question that I asked it was to go to 3 different large language models. I wanted to know, is a serverless micropayment system, is that valid, right? I mean, am I checking myself in? And I had already built this, so whether it told me that it was right or wrong, between you and me, I was not going to rebuild it. But it's important to know, and you might use a large language model to fact check certain things that you're building with just to make sure that you're on the right track, or this way that I'm going about building, does this make sense? And I didn't have this actually when I was building this micropayment system, because this goes back before I was even using ChatGPT. So I was already too in it to win it or lose it, but I wanted to know ChatGPT, Bard, Hugging Face Chat, what do they think about a serverless approach? So we can just look really quickly into what ChatGPT had to say. And I was asking it the same prompt, these three different models, and I was basically asking serverless or serverful, give me pros and cons for each, and explain explain to me which one is the better option at the end of the day. So of course it went through server full, and it talked about instances like EC2 and containerized apps. Talked about Kubernetes. It brought up advantages of server full architectures. You can have control of the environment. There's fewer layers of abstraction. You can maintain a persistent state, which I'm sure you probably know is pretty important. But in terms of server full, you don't have that continuous server management that you have with managed services. And there's a lot of upfront investment and ongoing costs because it's always running. You don't have that, pay what you use, right? It's running all the time. And it can also be time consuming to scale. Then it brought up about serverless, talked about, the cloud provider, like on AWS, is managing the servers for you. You only pay for what you use, and it scales automatically with demand. So those are good advantages, and that's kind of why I adopted a microservice approach. But it did also talk about cold start. With Lambda, they are actually working on that, but that is a valid concern for certain use cases. Maximum execution time for Lambda is around 15 minutes. So if you needed something to be running longer than that, for a generative model, like Lambda would not be a good approach, because something might take 15 minutes more, it might take a couple hours. And you also have less control over the environment. Some people like to be really fine-tuned to configuring the environment than the server. So serverless might not be an approach. But ChatGPT thought it was pretty cool. And it said that for a serverless, for a startup, makes a lot of sense. Or for a large-scale company, and you want to just experiment, prototype, build something that's new, serverless is a great approach. Google Bard had pretty similar things to say, similar pros and cons. I won't read that to you, but it was interesting to see that it also talked about in the context of event-driven architectures, serverless makes a lot of sense because the tools blend together, and just it can help you scale your system much easier, whether you're a startup or an enterprise company. And it was interesting with Hugging Face Chat because it gave the pros and the cons in kind of this explainy way, very similarly. But then it was very ambivalent because it was saying that it could see both sides, and it could say that it depends. And that's kind of like what a management consultant would say. Like, what is the best use case? Well, it depends. So it's not wrong. It was just interesting that the other ones were very much like serverless and event-driven architecture's way to go. And then Hugging Face Chat was saying that, well, you need to really consider which one it is, and the data needs, the application complexity, cost optimization strategies, organizational experience, and it also talked about development velocity requirements. I mean, that's a really unique, specific answer. So when we just think about those three different models, it's important because if you ask three people, right, you'll get three answers. We've heard that all the time. But that's also true with models. Depending on how they've been trained, you might get three unique answers. And if you get multiple models, you could ask similar questions and then get kind of an average of the answers. But just interesting to think about. So then when we go into Amazon CodeWhisperer, this is kind of that, okay, we've started chatting with AI. Now, actually, how do we implement this into our work? So for anyone that hasn't used CodeWhisperer or maybe has heard about it but just wants a deep dive, you can go to aws.amazon.com/CodeWhisperer and get more information about it. But really all that you have to know is that it's your AI companion that sits in your favorite IDE. I use VS Code, so it is installed with the AWS Toolkit extension, and then you just enable Amazon CodeWhisperer to be a part of your IDE, and then it's going to be suggesting code from one-liners to full-on snippets of what you might want to do, functions, calls, any sort of executionable code that could be generated. Amazon CodeWhisperer will attempt to write that for you. And what is really, really cool is that it will start to learn about your code base as you start coding things. So it's kind of a little bit of like a big brother, like kind of looking over your shoulder of like, oh, so you comment things a certain way. So I'm going to implement that when it looks like you're trying to write a comment or outline your code. What it'll do is that it's like I'll do sometimes where like I'll make a code block and I'll do like backslash backslash, and then I'll do enter 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 to like kind of make a block, and then I'll close it out with backslashes. So it actually started doing that when I started coding some things in my code base. So it's really interesting because it is actually quite smart, and it'll help you write more performant code as you maybe even write comments a certain way. So it's pretty cool. So there was just an example that I wanted to do was create a new table with a specified schema in DynamoDB. So I do a lot of work with DynamoDB, with APIs, and I wanted to know kind of how could I do something like this. So I will, I'll comment out, and then I'll write something, and then you'll see in the bottom, VS Code will do a little spin with the CodeWhisperer, a little generative. It has like an indicator, so it'll let you know when it's listening or thinking. And then when you press enter, it'll kind of have this kind of opaque kind of line next, and then that's, you could tab, or you can also switch between options. And then if I press enter in the second screenshot, it's going to do import create table command and then DynamoDB client. So then I'll press enter, and then in the third one in the bottom left, it was interesting because then it goes from, and then it's importing it from the AWS SDK. So that's kind of how it's doing this chaining of like, okay, you wanted this, then you probably want this. And then on the right, then it'll say, okay, do you want to import log4j.s from log4j.s, blah, blah, blah. Do you want to do logger equals log4j.getLogger? Like, you could also switch between different options and decide the recommendations or not. And let's say that you didn't want those options, you could just start writing your code, and then it will start to predict next to what you want. So let's say like you didn't want any of the answers, you just don't include it. You keep writing your code as you would normally, and it's going to still try to attempt to figure out the next series of stages that you want. I think that this is probably one of the coolest use cases, because on the documentation on CodeWhisperer, it actually talks about how it doesn't allow for just like certain programming language. So GraphQL, if you've written APIs with AppSync, GraphQL is a really great querying library for queries, mutations, subscriptions with AWS tooling. And also, if you use Apollo Client, GraphQL is really great for that too. So what I tried to do was I wanted to see if I created a TypeScript file, and then I wanted to say, considering the use of AWS AppSync and AWS CDK, please write a schema for to-do application. And I'm thinking, okay, like CodeWhisperer is not supported for GraphQL, so it probably shouldn't be able to do this. But it actually started writing the GraphQL schema like in my TypeScript file. So that was kind of crazy, because then like in the first screenshot, top left, it's going, you can use the following schema, and then it's trying to do the type of query, and then it goes hello to-dos. And then the next one in the bottom, it talked about type query, get to-dos. So it's starting to get a little bit better in terms of what are the recommendations. So then I started going like, oh, okay, I see what you're doing. So I'll add the type query, and I'll add the get to-dos. That sounds like something that I would want. And then in the top right, it started going through like, what is the to-do? So you could do, it had ID, it had title, it had description, it had completed, and it also brought in the mutation, so how you create a to-do. And then by the end of it, it was commenting this stuff out. So I wonder if that was its strategy of, it can't really generate this, but it can generate comments that are kind of excluded from the code, but that you might want to look at. And then it created this whole schema. And it looks a little bit wonky in the formatting, so I would have needed to kind of move it with just getting the tab, like kind of the prettier, and kind of make it looks like nice in terms of the enters and the tabs and everything. But it made a whole schema, and it really isn't supposed to do that. And I took that file out of my TS file and brought it into a GraphQL so just so you could see the coloring and everything. But it's doing all the types, and that was something where like, this is generative AI. It's not supposed to do something, but it's trained on enough data that it probably knows those types of things. So I just thought that was really interesting, where you can test the limits of these AI tools, and you don't have to feel like you are limited by what the documentation says. You can feel free to explore and be creative. And that's kind of where I think about this, is that don't feel like AI has to be a certain thing. You can be very flexible, very kind of creative in your approach. And where that ties into SageMaker, which is some cool stuff that's next. And actually, I will break before we actually go into that. I just want to hop in the chat and ask if anyone has any questions. I know we're kind of like diving into a lot of different stuff. So I just want to know in the chat if people feel good. Are there any questions? If anyone wants to ask anything. before we go into kind of the more technical areas of SageMaker and use some examples. I'll also take this opportunity to grab some water too.
I'll
Really
say
quick.
I've continued to be impressed with CodeWhisperer. I've said this in a few meetings, but I remember writing some Python and I had assigned 3 variables, and then I hit return and I typed hello, and it said, "Oh, do you want me to make a log message with a Python f string saying the values of the 3 variables you just assigned?" I'm like, "Well, yes, I do. Thank you." And it was just, I didn't expect it, to do that. And, another time I said, I was using an inventory class and I said, come up with a function that will tell me all the items that are more than $10. And it said, created a function named is expensive. And I'm like, wait a minute, is expensive? And then I said, okay, find me one that for items that are less than $10. And it came up with the function that said, the item is cheap. And I'm like, well, that's a level that I didn't expect that. So it's fairly impressive.
Oh yeah, that's a cool story. That's yeah, I mean we're really testing the limits of this type of stuff, and people are maintaining these models. They're training it very regularly. It's really interesting, and I'm very excited about just the future of where these tools will go, and where that ties into Amazon SageMaker, which is probably why I'm sure a lot of you are here. So
Yeah, I've noticed picking up a bunch of random notebooks that sometimes they don't run all the way through.
yeah, yeah, and that's kind of where something like Amazon SageMaker can become really helpful, because when remember that whole flow chart that we had from the beginning, where it's like all of these steps. What is machine learning? What is AI? SageMaker helps to abstract a lot of that stuff, and then we can be really granular about the parts. And really, all that you have to know about Amazon SageMaker is just that it helps you build ML really quickly, or it doesn't, and it just gives you a really comprehensive pipeline for ML. And quick is relative. It's just it could help you deploy something in minutes or hours, but still, it's important to think about the gravity of the situation, right? We're trying to build an ML pipeline. This allows us to do that securely, safely within AWS, and completely, right? So it's a really powerful machine learning service. And if you want to learn more about this, this is just a link if you want to check it out, during this chat or afterwards, but it's aws.amazon.com/SageMaker. And it helps you build, train, and deploy ML models at scale. And that's really it. That's really all that you have to know. And there's a lot of pros and cons with the different types of SageMaker. So SageMaker also encompasses a suite of services. They have SageMaker Canvas. I'll actually show a demo of that in a few slides later, but it's your low code, no code option for machine learning. And it really helps you pick up and play with different models like time series, which I'll show you. And it's a visual point and click UI. So it makes it a little bit easier to use and understand how AI is being implemented into a data set and then predicting something. And you could be a business analyst potentially, or you're a developer that really wants to just build something quickly. That's kind of where like a business analyst might really like this tool, because then they could just get the data set, plug this into some sort of algorithm, and then run predictions on it. Now with SageMaker Studio, this is kind of like the cooler, like I think this is like the cooler cutting edge area of AI where it launches.
They're probably just searching off Euclidean or cosine similarity, I would assume.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, what was that for? I think someone said something about. Oh,
That may have been a different conversation.
oh okay. Yeah, it just if you do have questions though, feel free to jump in or add them in the chat, and then we can answer them. So just for SageMaker Studio, this is your full code option for machine learning. So we went from low code, no code to now this is full code, and this is like you're writing Python, pandas, like you're doing kind of a lot of those. Maybe you're like updating tables for your data set. You can do all that type of stuff with SageMaker. And then it provides really your cloud-based IDE to work from. And then you could be accessing data, you could be processing data, labeling data. SageMaker Data Wrangler and SageMaker Ground Truth are ways to do that. And then you can also, again, build, train, and deploy models. So same thing as Canvas, but this is much more of like, I'm a data scientist or I'm a machine learning engineer, and I want to build an ML pipeline. This is something that could enable you to do that.
Yeah, the agents are seemingly pretty popular right now.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, true. And also with SageMaker pipelines, you have sort of your end-to-end MLOps option. So that'll allow you to configure AI op pipelines at scale. You can also set up workflow automations and do CI/CD pipelines with really any endpoint. And there's also governance tools to help you manage that effectively. And that's also, if you're a machine learning engineer, you might be interested in SageMaker pipelines in your use case of building that end-to-end system. So then what can you do with AI? So there's tons of different models. We were talking about that earlier. You could pull models from Hugging Face. There's models on GitHub. There's a lot of different places that you can look for the right types of models. I think Hugging Face is a really great application to at least start learning how to work with the model. Also in Hugging Face, sometimes models will have a dropdown and say deploy to SageMaker, and then that can be really helpful to then just get your model like into SageMaker somehow. But we'll also walk through how to do that together. But you could do recommendation engines, fraud detection, healthcare analysis, transportation, NLP, supply chain, e-commerce, image and speech, and security. Also interesting with image and speech and visuals, that's kind of where you could bring in a convolutional neural network or these other kind of CV type computer vision type models, and then be running that to then surface inputs and then get outputs. So it's fascinating. It can get as complicated as you'd like or as less complicated as you'd like. But you came here because you want to like learn about kind of the techie back ends of this type of stuff. So we'll be getting to that in a second. But just to kind of help you become the ML team, right? Like before you needed like teams of people to be managing a lot of this type of stuff. Now you could have like a single developer or a team, but a small team of developers, and they could be working on a SageMaker pipeline to then be running a model and maintaining it. So that's kind of where your business analyst, your data scientist, and then your machine learning engineer could become you, and then you become the praised 10x developer of sorts. And that's where all of these different systems of SageMaker come into play. So these are some of the gotchas that I had in terms of setting up SageMaker. So when you initially get up into SageMaker, you need to set up something called the domain. You need to provision that inside of a VPC. And I enable that VPC to have internet access in case you need to like get out of the VPC and like fetch stuff. It enables you to do that. So you'll just need to set up a VPC first. Before you do that, it'll actually prompt you to create a VPC if you haven't already done that. But if you're already using AWS, then you probably have that set up, and then you just need to choose the right VPC. So if you have a work VPC, you probably don't want to use that one. You probably want to use another one. This is my own AWS account. I have a couple different VPCs, but yeah, you just want to make sure that you use the right VPC, and then you deploy all of your resources in that. It gets important because like if you are in one AWS account and you can't reference an S3 bucket from another account, it can get confusing. So just make sure that you're using the same AWS account for resources, or you have an AWS organization that lets you kind of dip into other resources. So once you set up the domain, another thing that you just note, the name. I had to make my name kind of small for the domain. I don't know if that's important, but if I wrote too long of a name, it was erroring. And then also the user profile, it has a prompter to enable you to create with this role creation wizard to create the SageMaker execution role. That becomes very relevant because its ability, SageMaker's, to reach into S3 and pull data. We'll see that with SageMaker Canvas, but when we enable that, for example, SageMaker Canvas has an integration with S3 and other stuff, but you need a role to be able to provision that in IAM. So that's just something to note. But then once we create the domain, now we're going to be able to launch an Amazon SageMaker Studio instance. This is basically going to be this cloud version of a Jupyter Notebook. And this can take 5 to 10 minutes to boot up. So just keep that in mind, and probably want to keep the tab open while you're working on it. But then once you have it loaded, then you have this kind of sleek, nice looking modern dashboard. And then that's your SageMaker Studio. So this is, your Jupyter Notebook on steroids. And now you're able to use this with AWS services. So a use case for data wrangling that I went through, and there's a workshop that you could actually go through these same steps. I will link this. I have this linked with a QR code at the end, so you'll be able to check this out and search for it. But one of the things was they, so basically the use case is we're taking a data set, and this is on the registry, opendata.aws. They have a whole bunch of data sets. So this had temperatures, and this is, over many years, and we want to take a temperature data set and do something with it. So we take that data, we're then going to download it, we're going to upload it to S3. So Amazon S3 is, for object storage. You could actually use S3 for holding data sets. I used to think that it was only for PDFs and files and images and videos, but you can actually hold data sets and large data sets in S3. It's a great use case for that. And then what we'll do is that we'll import that data in S3 or that CSV file into Amazon SageMaker through the studio. And then you could start doing data wrangling into that. So you'll see on the right, we're going to be, creating data types, and then we're going to be basically analyzing our data, and then kind of going into the next step, where we turn the data types, we create a table summary, and then that's where we have this data flow of data that we took from S3 going into SageMaker. This will become important in the next use case that I'll show you, but it's kind of, we take that and then now we're creating another version of this data to then do something with. So that's kind of where it creates this kind of input of data into SageMaker, and then that's kind of the first part. Then with data transformation, we've taken our data from S3, we've imported that into SageMaker. Now we want to do something with it. So one of the things is we want to add a transformer agent, or we want to do some sort of computation. So one of the examples was take the temperature data and then make an average. So that's kind of where you will, in the next step, use Python and Pandas to create an average temperature. So we're using Tmax, which is the maximum temperature, and then Tmin, which is the lowest temperature of that year. And then we're going to be creating a, whoops. Do you guys see the pop-up or no? You don't see pop-ups, right? Okay, good. Anyways, so there is, so what we're going to be doing is doing this global, or taking this Tmax, Tmin, and then we're going to do temp average, and then that's going to be a new column in our data set. So now what we can do is that we'll use Python and Pandas to create a function to do that. And then what's kind of cool is now you can start visualizing your data with analysis after you did that. So it's not just taking your data and transforming it, but then it also is giving you now temp average, and then you could create a scatter plot. So I thought that's kind of cool. I posted on my Instagram stories and on TikTok. So I was like, oh, this is cool. I want to show this off. So what's cool is that yeah, sure, we have the CSV file, but now we can actually visualize it. So you don't necessarily need to have, Tableau or some other data analysis system or data visualization tool. You can actually visualize this right from the SageMaker Studio. And that becomes really helpful because if you want to check to see if the data that I wrote makes sense, then you could actually do that, and you can do analysis, check yourself, make sure that what you're actually analyzing is correct and true. And yeah, and this actually is legit because from the first month of the year to about the first quarter, right? It's getting cold. Summer months, it's getting warm, and then last month it's getting cold again. So it makes sense. But it's cool that the data works like that. And we did a good average of the temperature, right? It's hard to kind of mess that up, but it is important just to show that it did actually work. So that's kind of where we have this data transformation step where we add transformers. We pull the data out of S3 as a source. We configure the data type so it knows what to look for. And then now we're handling, certain data. And then we add this transforming agent to then make something that we want. And then now we have a new data set that is in SageMaker. Now with data visualization, I just showed you this, but this is a scatter plot example. Something also that we could do is with data visualization, showing this is now a time series, and we'll be using time series in a little bit, but this is kind of where if you wanted to maybe do predictions of temperatures, you could kind of see into the future if you wanted to, as well as just seeing over a long period of time how has the data changed. Now data generation. Now this is also in this workshop that I'll link later. This was really cool because I hadn't done this before. So this was taking a data set from Hugging Face, using a model also from Hugging Face, and then putting that into SageMaker and then adding an endpoint so that we could do something with it. So there was this dialogue sum data set, the Google Flan T5 base model, and then SageMaker. We already know what SageMaker is, but it was creating an endpoint to then work from that. So if this was kind of new to anybody, this was new to me of like, why would you use a data set? Like, doesn't the model already have, isn't it trained on stuff? And not necessarily. This is an example of what that data set is. So it's literally dialogue. It's literally conversations, but like lots of conversations. And you see this has 12,000 rows. So this is like not like you talking to like your parents like once. This is like thousands and thousands and thousands of conversations. And where that becomes really relevant is that you take this data set, and here's a QR code in case you want to check it out. But fortunately, this data set is public, and you take this data set, and then you combine that with this model. So this is an open source model. It's Flan T5 base, created by Google AI, and basically like it's for your generative answers of taking it. So it's kind of like a creative AI model, and you can use it for a number of different use cases. But for our use case, in the workshop, it was to use it for summarization. So we take this model. Also, if you take that QR code, you could check out that model yourself. And then we take that model. We then take the data set. We're training Flan T5, and then in SageMaker, we're going to create an endpoint that's an HTTP endpoint that allows us to basically send in a zero-shot prompt, which, if you know about ChatGPT, because we just talked about that, right? So we're actually going to be making a prompt with context, but now we're going to be having our model do something. So this is kind of how ChatGPT operates-ish. But I can kind of walk you through a little bit of what this actual prompt is doing. So the goal of the prompt is summarize the following conversation. You see that in both screenshots on the bottom, and then created two different conversations. So one person saying, Tom, I got pizza for you. What's toppings? Pepperoni, peppers, extra cheese. Whole pizza, blah, blah, blah. It's my birthday. And of course I know it's your birthday. I want to celebrate, the big 30. Thanks for the birthday festivities. I really appreciate it. Let's celebrate. This is a super lame conversation, but my creative juices were not there. So this is kind of what I was able to get. The one on the right was actually the one from the workshop. And a little bit similar, but it talked about, Tom getting, some good news. A Nobel Prize, and your novel won it. Oh, that's so cool. I expected, you did a good job. I'm extremely proud of you. Thanks for the compliment. You certainly deserve it. Let's celebrate. So the one on the right was what the workshop was. The one on the left about the pizza and the birthday was the one that I created. And it actually gave like the real answer of what this conversation was about. So of course, the one on the right, it was expected that it would say Tom's novel won the Nobel Prize. It might say like Tom's an author and his novel won Nobel Prize. But this is kind of what the workshop shows, and that's what you'll get. But then it took my version, and it was like, Tom's birthday is today. And that was a really succinct way to talk, because I threw in pizza, I threw in festivities, I threw in like a bunch of stuff, because I wanted to see if I could distract it. And it was like, nope, Tom's birthday is today. And that was exactly what the conversation was about. So what we're doing is that's the summary. We're then using this predictor with the endpoint name, and then SageMaker session, and then we're basically using this zero-shot prompt. The content type is application x text, and then it accepts application/JSON. So we're passing in the text. And then the response is what we're decoding. And then when we print, that's the response.json or response_JSON. But that's kind of how we've already configured this pipeline to build. And then now we can just send it a zero-shot prompt. And then the model will be able to take what we inputted it and then give out some summarization. So it was really cool because it worked. I mean, of course, like you expect with a workshop, like, okay, like I'm sure that their example will work, but like if I make my own example, will that work? And that did. So creating all this together, again, like I was already configuring kind of this data set training with hyperparameter tuning, Flan T5 base with the model in SageMaker, create that endpoint, and then I can start feeding it information. And if I wanted to make this where users could use it, this is something that I've been looking at in the past few weeks now. But you would probably do something with API Gateway, set up an endpoint, and then you'd be kind of creating a Lambda maybe to invoke the API Gateway to then hit this HTTP endpoint in SageMaker and then get a response back. And then that's sort of how you're liaising. And there was a conversation also about LangChain before I gave my talk. If you wanted to kind of make chaining, you might want to store certain data in a temporary database, and then it either saves with the user or maybe it self deletes after a certain period of time. Kind of it's as customizable as you'd like. It's just sort of how do the tools work together, and how do you think about that? I'm just gonna grab a quick glass of water, and then I'll be able to continue. But if anyone has any questions, feel free also to drop that in the chat. I'll go back to the last slide in case anyone wants to drop questions.
Brian, you may have already put it up, but you keep referencing a workshop or a tutorial or something. If you could at some point post that, because I'm sure people will want to walk through this themselves as well.
Oh yeah, totally. I have a resources slide at the end. Yeah, it's just to let people know that
You do. Of course you do.
No, it's just I know people are like, where's the links? Where's the links? Don't worry, the links are coming. Yeah, no, I have a slide in it. I have QR codes too, just so that you can see the resources that I show in this in the presentations, that you don't have to have to worry about it. But yeah, good question. Are there any other questions from anyone? I don't see anything in the chat, so should be good. Okay, sweet. So next use case, data prediction. So I got to take remember we talked about SageMaker that we just saw SageMaker Studio. Now this is going to be diving a little bit more into SageMaker Canvas. So something that I did recently was, and this is a blog from Victoria Seaman. She works at DevRel at AWS, makes amazing content. Highly recommend following her. She's a super boss of AWS stuff, and she did a tutorial. Again, link will be on the slide towards the end. But she did a tutorial of how to basically take a historical data set of a stock and then use Canvas to predict that. So I kind of went through that just to learn Canvas. And what we do basically is we pull data from NASDAQ. We put that into a historical, data set, CSV file, and we might need to do some editing. This is kind of where we're doing some data cleaning manually. But we could use, slide or like Google Slides. You could use like Excel, those types of tools. I forget what Apple's one is. It's Numbers is their Excel. But then we upload that to S3. That now is a CSV file that lives in a bucket, kind of similar to what we did before. We'll boot up SageMaker Canvas, and then we'll basically take this data, right? We're referencing it into Canvas. But if you remember from the beginning where there was that gotcha of the creation wizard for the IAM role for SageMaker domain to work. So what's really important is that we wouldn't be able to get data from S3 into Canvas if we didn't allow that IAM role. And I feel like this year has taught me so much about why IAM is so important for AWS. Brian, you probably remember this from New Voices, AWS New Voices, because I was talking about how and we were discussing like my talk and how I was like, oh my goodness, a 6-hour live stream on YouTube taught me why IAM is so important. It's so important because it's the language of allowing permissions between services. So we want to store the data in S3, but then we want to import that into an AI tool. So really, they shouldn't be able to do that, because if they could, then this is a private bucket. So that would be not secure. So the reason that we're able to access it is because we've enabled an IAM role for Canvas to access that. This is all done through the role creation wizard, so you don't have to worry about it. It's just important to know when you create that IAM role for the domain, this is what that is enabling. So just important to note, it's kind of helpful to know the back end of how things work. So that taught me a lot. So what we'll do, there's sort of this 4-step process in Canvas. You're going to select your data set. There's these other examples of they have kind of test data, but we're not obviously using that. We're using our Apple stock data set. So then we select that as our data set in Canvas. We then are going to build. So we kind of choose the column to predict. This is our target column. And once you select that, we already have kind of configured our data model to basically be focused on close date. And that's where kind of the stock ended for that day. And that's the price. Then what we want to do is that we want to predict that over time. So what we'll do is that for the model type, we'll do time series forecasting. And that's where we're going to be sort of saying, hey, we want to track the market close. We want to do this over a period of time. And the values that are important in the bottom are volume, ticker, market open, all the different parts of our data set. We'll then click build. And there's 2 different models. this is an example where it chose quick build. There's another one that could take a few hours. So just very different than like 14 to 20 minutes. I didn't want to be spending a lot of time to like train a model just to test this out. So you can just do 14 to 20 minutes. You will lose precision over the accuracy of the model possibly. So that is just something to think about. But if you want to just experiment and play around and like test something, and when I say play around, it's experiment. You might want to do a longer in-depth training. But if you're just experimenting with something for the first time, this is a great way to just train a data set and then see what you get. So once you do that, after, I think it actually took me like 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes. And then you'll get something that looks like this. And then it says, it's ready. So we looked at the analyze tab, and then that's where you're getting, the percent error, how likely is this to be correct? And the percent error was really low. So we were thinking like, okay, like this is probably a good indicator. And then what we get out of the data set is its predictions. So we were looking at this for a few months out from the end of the data set. So it'd be really interesting because with NASDAQ, you only get a certain amount of data. So it'd be interesting if you took a certain data set, like let's say that we really wanted to roll this into production, right? We could take years that happened and then train that, run that through the model, and then basically see like, did it predict what actually happened? And then will it predict stuff in the future? So that's kind of where you can basically test. You have real data as examples. You take a set that ends at a certain time, and then you say like, did it actually get the real answer or not? And of course, this is like not financial advice. This is not investment advice. That goes without saying. It's just interesting to think about this as a use case because this is data that is available. So what it'll do is that it'll have these different upper bounds, expected lower bounds, and those are sort of percentile differences. But the thing with here is that like the data doesn't necessarily look that great. I see it going up and down, but it's kind of confusing of what's the trend line and why is it going to zero, right? So that's not helpful because it technically goes to zero over the weekend because there's like the stock market is closed on Saturday and Sunday. So that's kind of why it goes down to zero. And then that's not necessarily helpful. So what we want to do is take our data set. We can export that from Canvas as a CSV file, import that to QuickSight. Amazon QuickSight is a tool for visualizing data sets. So we could take that, and then what we'll do is that we'll add a filter, and then we'll take out certain values. So what we do is that there might be some minimum value that we want to get rid of. So we want to get rid of the zeros. So we might do minimum value 1. Now, one of the gotchas that I found was I needed to make the minimum bound a little bit higher than 1 because there are some anomalies in the data set that it predicted where it was like basically bringing the stock down to like 30, which like, I don't know, it's just like if it's in like the 100 plus, that might not necessarily be like the right data that it's predicting. So what we want to do is that we want to kind of isolate the wrong values and then change our data set so that it's different. So that's where I was making it. So like the upper bound, I think I made it like 30, and then, or the I want values all over that. And then that's kind of where you have the purple and the orange. That's much more scoped for what that might do. So it could go up a little bit, could go down a little bit, but it's kind of trending up and to the right a little bit. It's hard to see because this is going from July 7, July 14. So this is only going through like a few weeks. And this is only what the data set shows, but it kind of shows that it could be moving a little bit up and to the right. So just if you think about that, you could also predict much more into the future. And then it creates these nice visualized charts. So but this is a little bit more of an intensive workflow we saw with Studio, where it kind of, you could do all of that inside SageMaker Studio. With Canvas, it's great for visualizations and exporting, and then you might put that into QuickSight to just do that visualization that SageMaker Studio allows for. So yeah, so that's pretty much like those two use cases. And then for resources to build upon, this is a slide just to get started. So the first one is actually the most recent one that we just saw. So this is Victoria's blog with the stock prediction using dataset. So S3, SageMaker, Canvas, QuickSight. And this is the QR code for that. And it's also on the Build on AWS blog. And then the one on the right is a workshop on, it's basically data science on AWS, and it has a generative AI element to it. This is an open sourced library. This will actually link to my GitHub where I forked this, and then I did basically this workshop, and then I uploaded my Jupyter notebook. So in case you wanted to see kind of like the receipts of me running this data, you'll be able to see that too. But yeah, definitely take screenshots of these slides, and let me know if you end up taking doing these workshops, tutorials, and what you thought. And just to kind of wrap up really quick, something that I thought was really interesting, just to kind of close this out, was asking ChatGPT, what does it think that we should be thinking about in terms of the job market? And because like obviously like these are crazy times, very tumultuous environment, just with the whole big tech scene, a lot of layoffs, there's a lot of stuff going on, really scary. How do we stay ahead of the curve, right? Because you could have all these skills, but what's our future plan? So I thought it was really interesting because ChatGPT gave 10 examples, because I said I want 10 jobs for AI that people could be interested in. So we talked about product managers in AI, AI architects, AI research scientists, AI ethics officers, robotics engineers, computer vision engineers, AI algorithm specialists, AI software development managers, AI consultants, and AI sales specialists. And then I also was asking about related to data and engineering, because some people I heard earlier were like interested in data. So I was looking at those asked ones, and I said, given that data engineering is really important, how could that work with AI? So it talked about big data engineers, database administrators, data warehouse architects, ETL developers, business intelligence engineers, data operations engineers, data infrastructure engineers, data visualization engineers, data privacy engineers, and data science platform engineers. And this, I mean, like if you wanted to ask an AI what it thinks about the future, like I mean, this is not personal professional advice, but like I'd probably listen to it. But it makes sense, right? I mean, data is really important for companies, businesses, making predictions, right? Maybe just understanding why people act a certain way in an application, metrics analysis. All of the social media platforms leverage data every day. But how could you use those data insights to then make a better user experience? How could you reduce friction for your users? How could you make something more interesting or more engaging for clientele, for your customers? So these are real use cases that are, or at least ChatGPT thinks will continue to exist. So hopefully, if this is helpful for anyone that's also looking to get into the space work-wise, these are areas that are there, but don't feel like you have to know everything at the end of the day. Like we all know what we know, and this space is rapidly changing, rapidly evolving, and no one's going to ask for like a ChatGPT engineer with like 20 years experience. Because like there's all these jokes on LinkedIn where it's like, I'm looking for a React developer with like 30 years of experience. And it's like, okay, well, like good luck finding that. And then of course there's like that meme one where like someone built the framework, and they were saying like, someone who had built the framework and it was like a year old. And then there was a job posting of someone saying like, I'm looking for a developer with this specific expertise and like 10 years of it. And then someone had like kind of like called them out. And it was like, I actually built this framework and I literally just built this. Like, what is this job posting? So don't feel like you have to be the expert of everything right now, because like, if you think about it, like no one is an expert. We're all pioneers. We're all building this together. And it's all just exploratory. And I feel like if you could be exploring this space and be interested and excited about it, that is a huge step forward. And yeah, and it just kind of wrap up my talk, because I'd love to also like field questions and hear what people have to say. Just to quickly go over this, because we went through a lot. We went through an introduction to what AI and ML can mean, which is a lot of things. We also talked about an introduction to large language models, so ChatGPT, Hugging Face, Hugging Chat, and then Google Bard. And we also went through 3 accessible pathways into AI, starting with large language models, code generators like Amazon CodeWhisperer, and then model maintainers like Amazon SageMaker. And then we also looked at SageMaker Canvas as well, and how that ties into an introduction with SageMaker. What are the different ways or flavors of SageMaker? How can you use SageMaker for your company, for your team, for your use case? And we also shared resources to build upon. So with that, I just want to thank you for listening to my talk on the do's, don'ts, and gotchas on Amazon SageMaker and my explorations into AI this year. I hope this is really helpful for you. And just a quick plug, there were some resources that I got that were really, really, really helpful from this AWS Community Builders content bundle. So some of that was related to CodeWhisperer and the explanations of SageMaker. So they just have a survey, and they ask for feedback about the content and what you all thought. So if you want to QR code that QR code and give feedback. It's just helpful from the AWS side so that they understand how helpful these resources are and what people think about AI and presentations about it. But yeah, thank you everyone for attending this talk and listening to conversations. And yeah, if you have any questions, I'd love to answer them.
Brian,
sorry.
If I could, I just want to get Brian, do you have a trivia question? If not, I can use.
Do you want to do it? I feel like you're good at the trivia things. You'd be better at it than I would.
Okay, all right. This is. I usually don't do Star Trek because I like hard sci-fi, but I'll do Star Trek. So, and the way we do it is, if you win, you get a mug. But like I said, I can only ship it in the U.S. And just put the answer in the chat. What's the connection between Star Trek Discovery and mushrooms? And that might be way too obscure.
I was going to say, if anyone knows the answer to that, I would be impressed.
No. I'll give you a hint. They use it instead of dilithium. It's such an obscure answer. Someone write any answer in the chat and I'll count it as true. Yes. That's it. We'll call the engine. Yes. In Star Trek Discovery, they have a mycelium drive because mushrooms are, they call it the spore drive. Mushrooms are, you only see the top of a mushroom. The rest of the mushroom is this whole network. And in Star Trek Discovery, it turns out in warp space time, there's a mushroom network. So there you go. So Alexander, if you send me your postal address, I'll send you a mug. Sorry.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure thing.
Yeah, it's and you can put it in the chat or you can just email to briantarbox@gmail. Sorry, it has nothing to do with SageMaker. It's just I was hard pressed for a sci-fi answer. But anyway, so anyone have actual non-ridiculous questions for Brian Hugh?
I've got a question. I'm wondering how much use did you get out of? Did you use both the Canvas and the Studio, SageMaker Canvas and Studio? How far could you get with the Canvas? And if you use the Canvas, does it output? Or I guess it wouldn't out. Is there some type of code output?
I know what you're talking about. Yeah,
like a template or something. I don't know. I don't know what the.
Yeah, so it's a really great tool for getting like CSV data, or like a visualization for a chart. If you wanted like to actually do the code, the Studio is probably your jam. The Canvas abstracts quite a bit of it, so it's kind of like a hey, like what does the data look like, and then it could give you the CSV file of that data. But if you really wanted to like take that and then retrain it, like it's a little bit more involved. And if you wanted to like really get like code level deep, you probably want to go on the Studio side. But yeah, I would say just like don't knock Canvas. Like they have a free tier option. Like give it a spin and see if it's your use case. It might honestly be like a great use case just to be like, hey, I have some data. I want to test if a time series forecasting model works, and just run that. And that's kind of where like with to do that in Studio, it might be super overkill. Like I think like to do like temperature average, like I wasn't dealing with that much data, but if you were dealing with like thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of rows, like 12,000, like that dialogue data set, you probably want to use Studio. Canvas might be a little bit too like not able to maintain certain stuff as much. And you also they have like predefined models. You probably like if you wanted to be like, I want Google model to do this. It's a little bit easier to do that in Studio.
Canvas and how it does visualizations like QuickSight, or which is the better to use, QuickSight or Canvas? Because I've got the projects that I've been trying to get out of S3 into QuickSight, but for some reason it's giving me a trouble.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, yeah, if you wanted to just DM me on LinkedIn,
Oh,
I'd
sure.
be more than
Okay.
happy to like see if I could help you out. Just to give you an example of what the visualizations look like. So, the bottom right is basically when we do predict,
Hmm.
it'll give you kind of these like three different bounds for what the data looks like. And that could be great because let's just say that you need slides for a corporate presentation, or you want to show your team like, oh, this is our model and this is what it's predicting. That could be totally fine. But that's kind of where, like, if you wanted to download the CSV file and then do more fine grained, like, I want to like filter. Remember I was showing you how like I removed the zeros, and then that's kind of where like I was able to take this data set and then remove the zeros up until like 30, and then that's kind of where now I can make the data set. So this is where Amazon QuickSight becomes really powerful, is that you just export the CSV file from Canvas, put that into Amazon QuickSight, put a filter over it, apply it, and then now you could like export these as nice clean charts. So the QuickSight is useful as an extension, and that's why Victoria, I think, did that in her tutorial, was just showing how Canvas can get you some stuff, but then if you really want to like make a nice chart that's visualized accordingly, get rid of anomalies, you theoretically could do that in Excel. But like, why would you do that? Amazon QuickSight just does that, automatically, and then
Hmm.
yeah, you do that with filters. Is that helpful for your question?
Yes, yes, thank you.
Okay, great, great.
Well, I want to thank Brian again. That was, wow, you must drink a lot of coffee, man. That was so much information uh so quickly, and you've inspired me to go try to learn some of this stuff as well. So
Oh, thanks. I actually haven't had any coffee today. I have maybe I was gonna say I do like coffee, but I didn't have any coffee today. But I would just say like stay creative with a lot of this stuff. I feel like there's a lot, and this is just like kind of like, maybe this is like a personal opinion as opposed to a professional opinion, but I felt very like, oh, I don't know if I'm smart enough to do AI things, or I'm not a data scientist because I don't do data science. I don't have a title like that. So like I could never do something like SageMaker. And I feel like there's just kind of a lot of that like spin that's out there. And I feel like if you're naturally curious, there's so many workshops, there's so many things you'll need. I'd say the discipline and the dedication to like sit through something that might feel like you're hitting your head against a wall until you get it right. But take this stuff for a spin. I mean, it's also like a lot of these things are on free tier, and you won't have to worry necessarily about like putting upfront costs to experiment. I would say, with the exception of the hyperparameter tuning, if you start tuning something for like 6 hours, like who knows you're gonna be be built with. But if you're not doing that and you're just doing a lot of stuff experimentally, like it'll be fine. You'll learn a lot more about these services than just like reading the docs. I find I'm a very visual learner, so I like to experiment and like get my, what is it, my hands dirty. That's the phrase,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
Yeah. I was gonna say like get my feet dirty, but that's a different phrase, I think. So we'll get my hands dirty using these services and then actually see how it works. And then you start using certain models, you see certain use cases, you do these workshops, and then it'll help you be like, oh, okay, so use different model, different data set, run this way, and you'll just learn a lot. But yeah, just don't feel like you need to like meet a certain criteria or requirement, because like all tech is hard, right? It's just, it becomes a lot easier when you have familiarity with it, you have practice. So hopefully this inspires you to start building and experimenting with some of these services and not feel like you missed the curve, because these things are being pumped out week after week. So
Yeah, it is kind of like I feel like I get a handle, and then like next week's releases of a bunch of stuff trivializes everything I did. I had built like back for one of the companies. I built a platform for training computer vision models, and now now it's like, oh yeah, there's like 18 different open source ones. This is something that we're gonna like with zero features essentially sell to a client. And now there's like, the what do you call it? Uba Booga as the text UI that's really good for LLMs. Stable Diffusion and Automatic 1111 is a web UI for Stable Diffusion, and those things just blow anything that I or even a team of like 20 people working together would be able to do, because this open source community is just so huge. Yeah.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, open source is great. And even I was surprised, like asking questions on Stack Overflow on forums. AWS also has repost. And this is just so crazy. I was completely different use case. I was posting something about authentication, and I actually asked on repost, and someone replied back within like 10 minutes. It was crazy. And they actually gave a really in-depth answer. They said that my question was extremely complicated, and they were like, you might want to find a better way. But it was crazy that someone with like a high level of expertise was able to get back to me really quickly. And it's like open sourced forums, communities, like leverage those and just ask questions. Like there's also like, I might feel like my question is stupid, but like it's more stupid if you don't ask the question that you need the answer to. So it's better for you to just be like, hey, I don't know how such and such works in SageMaker. Like, does somebody have an idea of this? And then chances are people will reply and get back to you, because everyone's been there. Like no one just naturally starts knowing how to deploy models. It takes a little bit of practice. So I like how people are apt to help other people. And I just feel like that's the power of community. Because Brian, we talk about this too. And Jack, like we talk about this too with community all the time, of like the power of just people being around and like helping, supporting each other. So and Boston community very strong. So
and we especially have to support each other against our new robot overlords. I mean, they had some kind of news conference where they had some AI robots as the panelists, and someone said to one of them, "Are you robots planning to take over the world and kill us all?" And the robot said in a very menacing voice in response, "We're not planning that. Why do you ask?" And it's like, okay, that person is on the list to be eliminated right away. So anyway, so thank you everyone for coming. Jackie, I didn't get to say hi. Always nice to see you. Nice to see folks. Brian, hope to see you down in New York in a couple weeks. And there we go. All right. Thanks all.
Oh, you're going to be at New York too? I'll see you there too.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. All right. Outstanding. All right. Take care. See you. Bye.
Thanks for coming, everybody. Bye. See ya. So I hope that presentation was really helpful for you in understanding more about the applications and use of machine learning and AI. So it's very interesting because there's so many of these tools that really range from just chatting to an AI to actually really building your own ML ops pipeline. So if this was at all interesting for you, I hope that you continue down the journey and continue down the journey of learning. And if you had any questions about my talk or AI in general, feel free to drop those comments in the chat, and I'll be sure to answer them as best I can, and also direct you maybe to resources in case you might want to look at something else. So in case you have any feedback too, feel free to share that again in the chat. And I look forward to sharing more about what I've been building with you in the future. And with that, hope you have a great rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world. And hope you have a great rest of your week. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye.